I think that what's probably the most amazing thing about a film like Contagion is that for a while, I honestly thought of it as one of Steven Soderbergh's most overlooked films, despite how well crafted it was in terms of plot, pacing, and editing. I mean, the editing was probably one of the most stellar aspects of the film itself. I still remember how I was perpetually glued to the screen the first time I saw it back in 2011, and around that time, I was within the frame of mind in thinking of how much the film felt very much like his 2000 crime masterpiece, Traffic. Now, Contagion is a lot like Traffic in how it tackles the highly complex subject of the illegal drug trade across borders, and it accomplishes this to the same degree through a multitude of narrative perspectives. It further accomplishes this without taking any particular character's side, so much as allowing the story itself and the players involved to present the facts surrounding the subject at hand and what it ultimately says about the topic as a whole. I mean, regardless of whether it is the illegal drug trade or a global pandemic. And now what can be said about a film like Contagion and what it means to the world today is essentially seen through the global pandemic of COVID-19 we are currently experiencing right now. Unlike the film Contagion, though, despite the rapid changes we are undergoing in terms of the structural alterations within government, border control, travel, and the effects the pandemic is having on the stock market, things are, I hesitate in saying they're relatively slow because every day there are new changes being implemented and we're learning new facts, but I would only compare it as a slow development in that we're still in the beginning stage as opposed to the film Contagion, which literally showed the entire process through a 135-day period that only led to massive structural changes. And ironically, it then goes all back to the very beginning of when the pandemic first began. Again, it's amazing how a film as groundbreaking and as terrifying as Contagion was at the time. It literally needed a pandemic, which is literally proving to be powerful enough to put the whole world on a pause button just to have its popularity skyrocket over such a short period of time. Since last December, Contagion has become the 7th most popular film on iTunes, and now it is listed as the number 2 catalog title on Warner Brothers in comparison to the 270 ranking it had last December. But then again, it shouldn't come as no surprise given how much we are now living in that reality of that film through several of the key issues we are experiencing, and that can be attributed to mass hysteria, which has led to things like panic buying and the toilet paper hauling epidemic. I mean, you go to a supermarket nowadays, and in just a matter of weeks since we went on a high alert, you'll be lucky to find one package of toilet paper. And then there's the fact that we've implemented social distancing, and who knows what the long-term side effects of that will be, and I'll discuss that further. And then there's media coverage of the pandemic. I mean, obviously, you have to report the facts, but there can also be a lot of misinformation, which can even generate more mass hysteria. I mean, we are aware that the numbers regarding the cases around the world can be inaccurate, despite the constant reporting in the U.S. and other countries, but even those that are more locked down than others. But due to the lack of testing, it's hard to determine the accurate amount of cases in the world, especially in the United States with the flawed healthcare system we have. And I mean, there's also the subtle side effect of discrimination towards Asian Americans regarding COVID-19 as though they're the direct cause. I mean, just because the virus originated from Wuhan, China, doesn't necessarily mean it has an ethnicity. But then again, people are more prone toward hatred than critical thinking. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat the fact that this is a vicious virus. I can understand why people are on the edge, because the thing that makes COVID-19 very scary is that the symptoms, when it comes to its symptoms, we have no immunity to it. I mean, a completely healthy person, or even a person with a less compromised immune system, because this affects much older people above their 60s. The fact of the matter is that there have been cases where even an infant died, where a 17-year-old boy was denied medical care because he didn't have insurance, and he ended up dying after feeling chest pain. it's just absurd. But then again, it just ultimately shows that this is a powerful disease and we weren't prepared for it, especially in the United States due to the last minute response. I mean, just look at the government. I mean, look at the lockdown we're currently undergoing, and then there's the stock market plummet, and even though it's steadied a bit, who knows where it'll be within a matter of weeks. And this can be the result of Trump's travel ban, as well as his lack of responsibility when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, the coronavirus, which he actually downplayed for weeks on end, even accusing it of being a Democratic hoax, which is just completely irresponsible. And now he's acting as though he knew all about it. It's pretty sad. Now, I'm talking deeper about mass hysteria. When it comes to the masses and the relationship to any event we're tied to, there's always a feeling of irony lingering around. And what I mean is that whenever we face a global crisis of any kind, whether it's a terrorist threat or even a viral outbreak such as the coronavirus, we're always told not to panic, and yet people do the exact opposite to a degree where it makes their madness equally, if not more terrifying than the initial threat of the virus. And you can see several instances of this active madness in acts that are equivalent to panic buying, the violence perpetuated against each other out of a sense of mistrust towards one another, and it's basically just simply the dog-eat-dog mentality that most global catastrophes prompt among the populations it affects. I mean, within a capitalist system such as the one in the United States, there already is a dog-eat-dog hyper-individualism that has made us more mistrustful and destructive to a degree where every instance we're only focused about making money and just succeeding in the most vicious and unsympathetic manners. And with the coronavirus now putting us on an edge where we could simply being near someone can put us at risk, it's only a matter of time where you'll see more examples of violence. I mean, there's already been violent forms of discrimination towards Asian Americans, and that's just simply a form of directly blaming them for a virus they had no control, they had no responsibility over. And then but just imagine how bad it's going to get as a result of this, once people just start getting even more distant from one another. I mean, Contagion isn't the first film to tackle a very cynical depiction of the human condition, and especially for the prospect of a major threat and how a populace gradually responds to it. I mean, when I ever think of a film like Contagion, I can also think of a film like the 2008 crime drama The Dark Knight, where every time the Joker makes a threat, you obviously see that it prompts a widespread panic, and that devolves into a very survivalist aggression where the population is willingly at peace with the idea of doing whatever it takes just to survive. And in this case, we can go back to the first video threat the Joker made when he was threatening the populace into giving Batman to him. They were willing to do it within a heartbeat. They were willing to throw him to the lion's den just to survive, even though it's pretty obvious that the Joker had power over them in that sense, because even if you give him up, I mean, there's no guarantee he's going to stop killing people, especially when he had the power to begin with. But then, and even the boat scene is another perfect example of just how the film illustrates the desperation and the types of measures people often take just to survive, especially when they're pushed against a wall and they see no other option of escape. And very similar to The Dark Knight, Contagion explores the concept of scapegoating for the sake of survival, and this is seen mostly through the character of Dr. Ellis Cheever, who was brilliantly played by Lawrence Fishburne, and he was my personal favorite character. Dr. Cheever works for the Centers for Disease and Control, and over the course of the film, his main struggle revolves around not only determining the root cause of the disease, but furthermore developing a vaccine in order to combat the disease. Now, like any medical thriller, a vaccine is found, obviously, and that comes from determining how the virus was derived. And in the case of the virus within Contagion, also known as MEV1, it came from bat and pig cells, that's very similar to the Nipah virus. The virus of MEV1 in Contagion has been compared to the Nipah virus, and the Nipah virus is a viral infection with symptoms that can range from anything like experiencing a fever, cough, headache, a shortness of breath, and even confusion. And these symptoms can be compared to not only the virus in the film, as well as the current COVID-19 coronavirus we are currently experiencing. Now, it would be redundant if not condescending of me, to assume that anyone listening to this podcast hasn't heard of the coronavirus, given that is basically the topic of the day, every day now, and will be for a very long time. However, it's less a stretch for me to assume that everyone has a clear idea of the exact symptoms or the nature of the symptoms of the COVID-19 virus, because it is an infectious disease and it is caused by a severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2. And the symptoms of this virus can include fever, cough, and shortness of breath, but that's only on a basic level, because one of the scariest things about the COVID-19 virus is that even people who are completely healthy can be asymptomatic, or anybody can be asymptomatic. It's basically not only an invisible enemy, but it's an enemy that can remain in disguise even when there's some level of a detection, and nobody's completely immune to it. I mean, I've heard stories of people beating the virus just through simple methods, or even having it returned to them. So right now we're just in the process of trying to figure out how to deal with it. But at the same time, the fact that this virus is that unique and powerful just puts us on the edge, and it's just we're not only in a vulnerable state, we're in a state where we don't even have the proper. It's not that we're short on ways of defending ourselves. We don't even know exactly how to perfectly defend ourselves. Now, the effects of social distancing within Contagion are something I'd like to talk about as well. Now, much like present life, the term social distancing, which will probably, if not sooner or later, garner some meme status. I mean, they're already making t-shirts making fun of the idea. Now, it's mentioned in the film as a way to avoid any potential contraction of the disease. Now, although the term is brought up and utilized in Contagion, and one thing to take into account and can be applied to our current situation, how can it be seen in an essential way it'll affect the ways we interact with each other from now on, because there's no denying that social distancing is a safety measure, and it's important that we do whatever we can to take these matters into precaution. Now, much like how Dr. Cheever advises people in the film to avoid large crowds and the constant washing of hands, the public has been advised to do the same. I mean, I live in Florida, and we've already issued a stay-at-home order, but with not as many restrictions as other states like California or New York, where they're on total lockdown. I mean, look, DeSantis is an idiot, and the fact that he's still allowing religious ceremonies and other businesses to work, I mean, yes, most businesses have been closed since last night, but the fact that he's still allowing those to go on is ridiculous, and it just feels kind of redundant, and I doubt it'll stop the spread of the disease. I mean, it'll probably slow it down a bit, but not to any significant degree. People can still go outside, attend to the elderly, walk their dogs, walk their pets, or even go out running, which, as long as they stay apart from each other, I guess is fine, because with complete isolation, being forced into our homes, who knows how long it'll be before somebody goes insane. I don't know, because I think it just depends on the situation. I think it's already based on the lack of, the response the U.S. made and how it did it last minute. It's only a matter of time. I mean, we're only a few days away from the peak anyway. But anyway, going back to the issue of social distancing within the film Contagion, it's a no-brainer to avoid large crowds, especially in tourist states, and like Florida, where I'm from. However, judging from my own experience, I've already had experiences where either myself or the person I nearly came into close contact with would create an even greater gap between us. Now, examples like these will undoubtedly become more prominent as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to escalate, especially in the United States, where we're getting daily reports of an increase of cases. And that's just what's on paper, and because I already mentioned that, because the accurate number is probably much higher, but we can't know due to the lack of testing kits our massively flawed healthcare system is administered. I mean, I've heard daily reports of hospitals in New York reporting the lack of ventilators they have and how they need way more than the president is distributing and having manufactured. And at the pace they're going, it's only a matter of time. I mean, it is a terrifying thing to show how flawed our healthcare system is, not just from a profit angle, but the fact that they don't even have enough supplies, that they're literally using refrigerated trucks and ambulances as storage, as temporary morgues to store bodies. And I even read somewhere that Columbia University is allowing medical students to graduate early just so they can join the fight. And I'm not the first person to say how brave these people are, but it's also sad because that they're having to put their lives at risk like that, especially when they're so under-equipped, especially with the masks needed to fight this disease. Or at least to protect themselves from contracting this highly contagious disease. Now, although I've talked enough about social distancing, I think the greater tragedy behind it, because as beneficial as social distancing can be, the sad element within it, in the act itself, is that we live in a digital age that has done very well to isolate us more than social distancing would naturally have done. And what I mean by this is that our era has become so isolated. We've become so focused in our own little worlds that I think social distancing will only escalate and skyrocket that. Contagion does an excellent job of depicting the more violent expressions often seen within the mass hysteria in response to a global pandemic, and that is something I don't think will be excluded from as the situation worsens with COVID-19. Social distancing will undoubtedly serve as a means of protection, as I already mentioned, but we've become much more isolated in terms of the impact of social media and how it's helped in desensitizing our culture. I think social distancing will breed the type of mistrust and hostility that has always fueled the very violence at the core of outbreaks that serve as a response to global crises. Even on a basic level, I remember listening to an interview with Noam Chomsky most recently on DM, which is like a European channel. He talked about how social media has isolated us so much that if you were to go into a restaurant or like say McDonald's, there's a good chance that if you see a group of teenagers sitting together at a table, they're having two conversations, or two types of conversations. The first one is with each other, which is normal, but then there's the second one where they're each focused on their phones, and they're probably talking to one another without eye contact while they're on their phones, having a conversation with another person, whether it's via text or some messenger app through a social media platform. And they probably have never seen this person, and that just shows the point of how isolated we've become as a result of social media. And social distancing will undoubtedly increase that over time. Another angle I thought Contagion covered rather effectively, and to a strange degree very much ahead of its time, was how when it came to social media, how destructive it's become. And as I already mentioned, since 2011, the increase of social media has made us more distant and more likely to engage with one another online rather than in real life. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that there's a greater chance that friends will sooner have conversations with one another via texting as opposed to picking up the phone and literally talking to one another like they used to. I'm not even going to sugarcoat the fact that I've had that similar situation where, as close as I am with someone like my mother, my relationship itself with her has had a similar experience where we merely text each other a good night, and that's it. It's not the only conversation we have, but the fact that instead of calling one another and say good night, instead of going about it via texting, shows how bad it's gotten. And I'm sure a lot of people have had similar situations, especially with people that they felt more close to at a certain point. And Contagion explores a similar angle like this with the character of Matt Damon and his daughter, who is isolating alongside him because he has some special type of immunity, which is never explained in the film, but apparently it's not out of the realm of logic. Now, as mentioned, they're both placed in the situation where Matt Damon, who is the father character, has to protect his daughter, and he places her in a position where not only can she not directly interact with her boyfriend, but at the same time, she's literally left to a relationship where she can't even communicate with her boyfriend outside of just texting. Instead, she could have picked up the phone and spoken to her, but all the relationship is boiled down to is that of a texting relationship, as opposed to just having a regular conversation like people would have normally done prior to the impact social media had in dominating in our culture and even our way of the ways we socialize with one another. One angle I'd also like to talk about when it comes to Contagion is that of capitalism and climate change involved in a global pandemic. I think that when talking about the global pandemics of MEV1 and COVID-19, we can see a great deal of exposure to vulnerabilities that were left unchecked. And I'm not just referring to the social aspects we've allowed that have made us become more desensitized. If you take things from an economic scale, and though I don't like to spend a lot of time on politics, I don't, despite me bashing Donald Trump, and I don't claim to be an economic expert because I leave that to a genius like Richard Wolff. I think that judging from the stock market plummet that resulted from the U.S. President's national emergency declaration, as well as the closing of many businesses which have left many employees across the U.S. out of the job and which will leave them out of the job over time because it's already predicted that the unemployment rate is going to skyrocket above 32% by June of this year, which will trounce that of the 25% unemployment rate we had back in the time of the Great Depression. And this only just shows the flaws within our capitalist structure. And now by analyzing capitalism from a climate change angle, there can be no arguing of the destructive effects that oil and gas companies have had. And the same goes for mining companies and the damaging threats they pose to the global climate. I mean, the constant burning of fossil fuels not only alters the climate, but also alters the migration patterns of animals, which can serve as carriers for the disease. I don't think any scene within the film Contagion illustrates this point more effectively than the flashback ending we're given right after Matt Damon's character's story arc ends and finds some resolution, not revolution, although revolution won't hurt right about now as capitalism is being exposed. Now, the flashback ending in Contagion shows a bulldozer that belongs to the mining corporation Gwyneth Paltrow's character worked for, and how it knocks down a tree, and which causes a bat to fly off into the distance. Now, the scene follows that bat, and it has it eat a piece of fruit, and it then drops a piece of that fruit at a pig farm. And by now you already know where this is going, because I already mentioned that the virus was comprised of bat and pig cells. And once we see one of those pigs being taken and then slaughtered by a chef working at the very same restaurant where Gwyneth Paltrow's character was before she began to spread the disease, as she shakes hands with that chef as they pose for a photo, it just shows how the cycle began and how it isn't as simplistic as postulating the origins of how a disease outbreak can start. I mean, there are many contributing factors that can lead to the kind of global pandemic Contagion depicts, as well as the COVID-19 one we are currently in the midst of. Because even though we know that we're certain the virus originated from the Wuhan district of China, there are theories that it could have even originated somewhere else, and that wouldn't come as a surprise. But then again, I'm sure people will still blame Asians for this, and Asian American discrimination will follow the same way Japanese American discrimination followed the Pearl Harbor attacks. Now, it's just absolutely absurd to blame the Chinese, and naming it the Kung flu or the Chinese virus is not only racist but completely irresponsible and unsophisticated, because when you look at the many facts surrounding the disease and what could have caused it, because it doesn't have an ethnicity or any form of discrimination itself. But even in saying this, I'm certain that most people often ignore these small factors or even looking at them and focus more on the simple and quick solutions that are being proposed. And just the overall fear and hatred they are more prone to surrender to in the wake of the growing number of globally documented cases. When it comes to Contagion in the film, I think it's fantastic, but I did have one issue, and that revolves more about its inability to criticize our healthcare system. I mean, I don't want to go too deep into that because back then in 2011, I'm not saying inequality wasn't an issue, but I doubt it wasn't as discussed as much as it is now. And given the damage perpetuated by the Trump administration and their catering over to corporate CEOs in the face of the global crisis we're undergoing, it's just become a far more prominently loud discussion to have, and hopefully one that will develop and build towards something for the people that are suffering massive inequality, especially as a result of this pandemic. At the same time, though, we can't deny the missed opportunity of the film, despite the fact that it is still a good movie, and I just wish it could have touched on it a little more in greater detail. I mean, it did tackle a globalized society in a very effective manner. Now, my final thoughts on Contagion, what we can learn from films like it, is that in the wake of a global crisis, I think it is important not only to remain calm and avoid the traditionally animalistic panic that is often associated with these events, but I think also that one of the main lessons to take into account from the film, and especially when we compare it to the current COVID-19 pandemic, is the more positive lessons that can be learned when looking at the multiple root causes behind such outbreaks. I already mentioned capitalism's role and its effects on climate change, and how that can accelerate these types of disease outbreaks that leave us running around like headless chickens rather than sane human beings. Now, in terms of the fossil fuel industry, the Green New Deal is not a radical proposition, especially now that this crisis is showing just how much we need to change the ways in which the energy industry functions. As bad and as worsening as COVID-19 will become, I think the one positive we can derive from it is that it has exposed many of the vulnerabilities within a capitalist system and the inherent dependency we've had on it, to the point where it's now crumbling. And hopefully that'll issue the kind of change necessary. And this has essentially opened up opportunities for the kind of change that could address the global climate crisis in ways we've never seen before, as well as the massive economic inequality that can no longer be ignored, because we're kind of running out of time. And I mean, I don't like to say this, but the virus doesn't really give a shit about our personal time frame, regardless of what Trump or a bunch of drunken spring breakers want to believe.